Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our October After Hours. My name is Candace Benson. I am the Outreach and Events Coordinator here at the Virginia Institute of Marine Science. This lecture series is made possible by the First Advantage Federal Credit Union, Marine Sonic Technology, a company of Atlas North America LLC, Phillips Energy, Canon, as well as the many other supporters of the VIMS outreach programs. I'd like to welcome everyone here in person tonight. Thank you for joining us, as well as everyone watching online, both in the US and we have a few international viewers on tonight. So welcome. Thank you for joining us. So let's get into our talk for this evening. Our lecture tonight will be given by Dr. Bill Walton, Acuff Professor of Marine Science and Coordinator of the Shellfish Aquaculture Program here at VIMS. Before coming to VIMS, Dr. Walton was director of the Auburn University Shellfish Lab on Dauphin Island, Alabama, a professor in Auburn University's School of Fisheries, Aquaculture, and Aquatic Sciences, and a marine extension specialist for the Alabama Cooperative Extension System. Dr. Walton conducts applied research with local shellfish farmers, resource managers, and national and local organizations addressing challenges and opportunities for shellfish aquaculture. His interest includes all aspects of shellfish aquaculture, including opportunities for public fisheries and restoration. Dr. Walton has a Bachelor of Science in Biology from Tufts, a Master's of Science in Ecology from Rutgers, and a PhD in Fisheries Science from the University of Maryland. He and his wife, Beth, have a shared passion for shellfish and also have a shared set of sons, Cameron and Quinn. And without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Walton to the stage.
Thank you all for coming out. I very much appreciate that. I know it's folks are getting used to coming back out to events in person, and I appreciate people logging in online. I have to do my disclaimer. Whenever I give a talk, I have no oysters to serve to you tonight. So if you came, I won't be hurt at all if you came for oysters to eat, and if you'd like to exit now. I am a huge fan of shellfish and the people who grow them and harvest them. And so the idea for tonight was the science behind the slurp. So how many people enjoy eating oysters? You have a few. Enjoy them on the half? So we slurp them down. And so this was the idea of trying to get into what happens before they get to your plate and before you get to eat them. Okay, so let's talk about getting food from the water. What does that mean? Well, when we think of getting food from the water, typically we think of fisheries. And so you can see in the orange and the red, that is our capture fisheries, when people go out and catch seafood from the wild. And that has basically leveled off since about the mid-1980s or 1990. We have not seen the amount of seafood that we're catching from the ocean increase. What we are seeing increase, if you look in blue, the dark blue is inland freshwater, and then the light blue is aquaculture from the ocean. So what does that mean? And you can actually see we have just recently tipped over to where more of our seafood is coming from aquaculture than it is from capture fisheries. That's just happened in the last couple of years. So what does that mean? Well, it does mean that that's what the world is doing. I have one thing that maybe is disappointing to some folks is we are only 17th in the world in terms of aquaculture production. When you look at the coast that we have and the coastal waters that we have to raise seafood in, we have not decided to do that as a nation. And there are a number of reasons that that's true. When you look at how we do aquaculture, and you can look at that with either the value or the production, but looking at value, most of our aquaculture is from freshwater. Anybody want to guess what that probably is? Catfish. So that's our primary aquacultured product in the US. But the success story in the ocean in the US is shellfish. So if you look at what we do grow in the ocean and grow well, we grow oysters, clams, and some mussels. Obviously, there's also some shrimp and some salmon, but our big thing is shellfish. And these are sort of the poster children of marine aquaculture in the US. So let's back up. And what does that mean to Virginia? Did anybody here grow up in Virginia? Shellfish, oysters, and clams, part of your memory of Virginia? So we've been doing this. Shellfish Resources have supported our coastal communities for millennia. So for the Native Americans that were here, for the early colonists, this has been a food source. This has been something that we've eaten. With railroads and intensified power dredges, refrigeration, the harvest increased. So this great abundance of oysters also went along with great demand for oysters. So early aquaculture arose with extensive oyster planting. Has anybody seen what that looks like? What extensive oyster planting looks like? Anybody seen the boats pushing shells into the water with the water cannons? So the earliest form of aquaculture for oysters is, forget hatcheries, forget doing any of that. You just basically have some private beds. And because they're your beds to harvest from, you make the investment of putting oyster shell over the side, and that improves the catch of wild oysters at that site. And so you get a cycle where you can repeat that and you can keep harvesting that bed. By the way, oysters were so popular in the late 1800s that if you go look at on eBay for oyster bills of lading, you'll see that oysters were being eaten in Missouri. They were being eaten in Colorado, Montana. That you'd see these they'd say fruit, vegetables, and oysters. This was a food source that we were exporting across the country. So this was tremendous pressure. And then in the diseases, particularly one called MSX and then dermo-intensification, really devastated the oyster culture. And this is when, I was told the camera would be here too, sorry. Okay, all right. So in addition to that disease, that meant that we switched over to a lot of clam cultures. Anybody a fan of clams? All right, so most of our clams are grown out on the eastern shore where it tends to be saltier, but not all of them. We have some on this side as well. That led to turning to what we call intensive aquaculture. And that's where you see oysters in some type of bag or floating device or on the bottom using hatcheries. And once you start using hatcheries, which I'll describe in a little bit, that lets you start doing selective breeding, and you can start to selectively breed for shellfish that survive disease better. And that was primarily led by VIMS. So where has aquaculture, remember I started with that, where has that gotten us in Virginia? This is a big deal. We are first in the US for hard clam production. We are first on the East Coast for the Eastern oyster production. Really, you have to get into the Gulf of Mexico, or we'd have to start looking at Louisiana and Texas for something close to what we do. And we know that from surveys that we've done here from the advisory program that our shellfish aquaculture directly employs hundreds of Virginians. So this is a major industry in Virginia. So I asked the question, why does VIMS work in shellfish aquaculture? Well, one, it's because it's a major industry. Certainly, we recognize those economic benefits. And one thing, when we think about workforce development, a lot of these jobs are in our rural coastal communities. So communities that maybe don't have a lot of other industries there, potentially shellfish farming is one of the things that they can do. We also look at domestic seafood production. Believe it or not, our seafood trade deficit is billions of dollars. We import billions of dollars more of seafood than we export. So that means there's demand here in the US for seafood, and maybe we can meet that. I'll expand on this a little bit in the following slides. It's also acknowledged as potentially environmentally friendly. That's another reason that we invest in this. And I think this last one, I put it on here last because I think this is underestimated. Shellfish aquaculture is culturally important. It allows us to continue a tradition of working on the water. I know that doesn't look like an oyster boat, but that individual has still got a work boat. They still get up, they still work the tide, they come back in, they're muddy, they're wet. It continues a way of life. And so if your grandparents did something like oyster harvesting, this is a way to continue that tradition. I've lived in a lot of rural coastal communities in the US now, and most of them aren't going a direction that I think is a great direction. A lot of our fisheries aren't the way we'd want them to be. And I do look at shellfish aquaculture as one way to provide those communities something that lines up with culturally what that community is built around, but also gives some economic opportunity. So let's go back to this shellfish aquaculture and the environment, because this is a biggie, because shellfish aquaculture is typically done in public waters. So it is reasonable for the public to ask, what is this doing to the environment? Is this, it's not all about jobs. What is the cost to the environment? What we have found is, let's start with the precautionary approach. Can we minimize environmental impacts. And in fact, it is generally recognized now that when shellfish aquaculture is practiced sustainably, that the impacts are relatively low. Now, don't get me wrong. I can have a shellfish farm and I can run it in a way that's unsustainable, right? But there are best management practices, and there's a clear, and this is how most of the industry is doing it, is trying to do it in a sustainable way. And so something like oyster culture, I just wanted to show you, this is from Monterey Bay Aquarium Seafood Watch. They actually give farmed oysters the green light. I think last time I checked, harvested oysters, I think they gave the yellow light to, which I actually disagree with. But they have actually come up with a high rating for farmed shellfish. They think this is something that has minimal environmental impact. Why is that? There's a lot of things up here. They have a complex scoring system. And I just want to show you that if you look at this, why are those scores for effluent and feed so high? The reason for that is shellfish are a funny thing to grow because you don't feed them. And because you don't feed them, you don't medicate them. There's no way to do that. By the way, that means you are very subject to what's happening in the environment around you. Shellfish farming is a funny combination of trying to produce something and dealing with what Mother Nature throws at you. You look at some of these other things, and I can answer questions about these at the end, but certainly it is generally recognized as having minimal impacts when done sustainably. But let's think about shellfish aquaculture. I don't want to just say it's okay because it has minimal environmental impacts. Can it have potential benefits? And this is one of the exciting things about shellfish aquaculture. Some people are calling it restorative aquaculture. That where you have shellfish aquaculture, the shellfish that you are raising on that farm don't know that they're not on a reef. So from their point of view, they're still filtering the water and improving that water clarity and reducing the nutrients. So if you think of all these oysters that are growing, they're eating all the green in the water, and we're packing them up and we're sending them to restaurants. We're taking some of the green out of Chesapeake Bay, right? They also may provide some shoreline stabilization through wave reduction. That's to be investigated. That's only, to the best of my knowledge, that's only been suggested. But one of the things that strikes me as somebody that goes out and works on some of these farms with these farmers, I cannot believe how much marine life lives around these farms. For anybody that fishes, these are a lot like these fish attraction devices that people put out. If you put an oyster farm in the water, it turns out that every little shrimp, every little crab thinks that it's got a little place to hide. So this is a oyster basket I dumped out. And in this, you can see that as I dumped it out, this was just one basket. You can see the shrimp, you can see the crabs. They think it's a great place to live. So now, as a shellfish farmer, do I want crabs in with my oysters? No, but I can also just let them go. I don't have to kill them to get them out. I can just open up the basket, and when I sort it, they can go out. So that's trying to introduce to you what shellfish aquaculture is and why we're in it. Let me tell you a little about what VIMS is doing in this. Try to demonstrate. We have been doing shellfish aquaculture for a long time here in the state. We've got a lot of scientists with really diverse interests and expertise. We've got an advisory program that has these very strong relationships with the industry and has been working with them for a long time. And we have new and upgraded resources. So I have this, I had somebody that's better drawer than me put this together. What I want to show you here is our Shellfish Aquaculture Program, that big circle. We have lots of people in that program, lots of expertise. And we are interacting with stakeholders. What's a stakeholder? Well, the fact that you're here and that you're interested enough makes you a stakeholder. I have listed some specifics like consumers, growers, the hatcheries, people who do research, restaurants, resource managers. But really, it's anybody that has an interest in shellfish aquaculture. And what I'm trying to show with that arrow is that with our Shellfish Aquaculture Science Initiative, we want that to be a two-way street. We don't want the science to come from everybody in that blue circle and then push it out to those stakeholders. We think our science should come from what those stakeholders tell us that they need and that they want. But every group of people starts with a foundation. And let me start with that foundation because we have upgraded 2 new facilities to help build a stronger base for our program. These facilities are going to let us conduct cutting-edge research. We know that they're world-class facilities. Importantly, it lets us study our shellfish through their entire life cycle. So from the day they're spawned to the day they would go to market. It lets us demonstrate and test new technologies, and it gives us a place to do training and education. So this is the new Acuff Center for Aquaculture. It's predicted to be finished in February. Just to give you a picture, this is right along the York River. We'll bring in seawater from that, and inside that building, we're gonna have some capacity for spawning shellfish. Where we live here, the water is really good for oysters. So we'll probably do mostly oysters, but there are other species we can do here. I won't get into the oyster life cycle too much, but we will have a place where I can certainly go into that if people want to afterwards. But we have a place that we can condition oysters and convince them that it's spring, even when it's not, which means they're more inclined to reproduce for us. Then we can get them to spawn for us. And in the York River, where a female might put 10 million eggs out into the York River, we can capture all those eggs in this hatchery and we can fertilize them. And that lets us do breeding programs, it lets us produce animals for testing, and it lets us work with the industry. By the way, I'll show you a picture of algal culture later, but we have, if you're going to raise shellfish in the wild and in the farm, they'll eat the algae out in the water. But in the hatchery, we're growing so many, even though they're microscopic, we have to grow the algae. We have to grow a salad bar for oysters in this facility. So we do have a salad bar production facility here. All right, on the Eastern Shore, we also have the Castagna Research Hatchery. This is really central to what the Shellfish Aquaculture Program at VIMS does, because I mentioned that we're #1 in hard clam production in the US. That industry is almost entirely on the Eastern Shore. So it is critical that we respond to that industry by having a facility out there that can work with those folks, and they can spawn clams at that facility more easily than we will be able to do here. There's been interest in alternative species. Some people may have heard of seaweed culture going on now. There's urchins. So this is a facility that we might be able to do that. Has anybody been out to Watchaprig? It's a beautiful new lab that's going in there if you get a chance to get out. And Watchaprig is a beautiful community. So as I mentioned, out at ESL, we can do hard clams, we can do bay scallops. So that's part of, some people want to grow bay scallops for the market, and some people want to grow bay scallops to restore. So working with the SAV, the submerged aquatic vegetation effort here, there's a combined restoration effort with bay scallops. Working with some hatcheries on managing their water quality, and there is also an internship program there as well. So if those facilities, particularly Acuff and ESL, are our foundation, I just wanted to highlight some of those blue circles that I had. Who makes up the Shellfish Aquaculture Program? Well, the first is our Aquaculture Genetics and Breeding Technology Center, or ABC. And I'm proud to say that ABC is the largest oyster breeding program in the US and produces selected broodstock for hatcheries along the East Coast. Currently, even though the Acuff will provide a home for ABC to do this, right now, ABC is operating 2 hatcheries, 5 field sites, and a lab for analyzing ploidy, disease, and sample preparation. So this is really a breeding-focused research part of the VIMS that works very closely with the industry. They also have a training program called the OAT program, and they have trained a number of individuals that have gone on to jobs in the industry. So these are some disease slides for you. These are probably things you didn't know about oysters, but the slides on the left, you can see oysters that you recognize, but above and below are cross sections of parts of oysters that show some disease. These diseases don't hurt us, by the way. They're like spots on apples, but they can be fatal to the oyster. So in the pathology lab, they've been working since the 1950, on diseases. It's really looking today at controlling the diseases and thinking, really, how do we help this industry improve their survival and get through this? And Dr. Carnegie, who leads that lab, emphasized that he's very interested in what he calls understanding the secrets of the oyster's success. So as oysters have recovered in Chesapeake Bay, trying to understand how that's happened and what's behind that. Our marine advisory program is really the folks, these are the eyes and ears of VIMS going out to the industry, working with the shellfish culture industry, the regulatory agencies and the external groups. And that is part of that. What do you need and how can we help? And then my own lab is the commercial shellfish aquaculture lab and team, sea salt. My work is really focused on how different choices made on a shellfish farm affect how many shellfish come from that farm and what the quality of those shellfish are, as well as looking at things like sustainability. What are the environmental impacts? What are the environmental benefits? I'm lucky enough to do what I call farm to table research. So we don't just stop with what's happening at the farm. We actually look at what happens from the time it's harvested to the time it gets to a restaurant, and then even how consumers react to this. So we do find that some of these farmed shellfish, you have the ability to brand your shellfish and be able to produce something that is uniquely yours. So it's really hands-on research, working with farmers, regulators, and consumers to help them make better informed decisions. We have many other areas of expertise at VIMS. One of the risks of highlighting a few is that I'm leaving folks out, but we have people at VIMS that work on clams and scallops and soft shell clams and seaweed. Some of you may have heard of the harmful algal blooms, what we sometimes get called red tides. We have people here that work with that. Vibrios, you may have heard of as well. We have people who do work with Vibrios and other bacteria. Ocean acidification is important. Shellfish have shells and acid is bad for shells. So trying to anticipate as the oceans are getting more acidic, what is that impact on the natural environment, but also how does it affect shellfish aquaculture? Where we see that, where we expect to see that first is in hatcheries with the vulnerable larval stages of shellfish. We have economists here. We look at environmental impacts and benefits. We have effects of climate change, and then we have a very large group dedicated to submerged aquatic vegetation and looking at the interactions between shellfish aquaculture and what we call SAV. So trying to understand that and provide best management practices. I've talked a lot about aquaculture. I am the Shellfish Aquaculture Program coordinator, but VIMS as a whole is very interested in fisheries and restoration. We are committed to providing that best science to help with fishery management and restoration. I said oyster fishery up there, but it really should be any shellfish. But I think what's interesting is those techniques that I just showed you to raise shellfish for commercial production, those could also be tools that we can use for fisheries and restoration. So if you're trying to restore a reef, we think about building the structures and letting natural recruitment happen. There may be some situations where spawning the oysters in a hatchery first may help that restoration effort, and that's something we can evaluate. I skipped an important point here is that I think it is critical that if this is premised on helping coastal communities, we're not trying to raise shellfish that are aquacultured that compete with the wild product. So, again, a couple of people did raise their hand that they're oyster eaters. Has anybody seen the varieties of oysters listed? All right. Many of those varieties are often farmed, and they tend to be a higher price point. Has anybody been to a raw bar lately and seen what oysters go for? All right. There's also oysters at Christmas time or Thanksgiving. You may go in and get the shucked pints of oysters. What we found is that the market sort of separates these brands. And so by adding a farmed product to what we do, we've found that we're sort of diversifying the product selections from Chesapeake Bay and Virginia rather than competing. So I think there's an opportunity for those to work together. So looking forward, the idea here is the Shellfish Aquaculture Science Initiative is taking that group of people and those stakeholders and doing something. And what are we trying to do? Our program is really trying to look at promoting this thriving, sustainable shellfish aquaculture community, both in Virginia and the US. And we're going to do that with our shellfish aquaculture science, outreach, and education. And I've got 4 complementary goals, and I'll go through each of those to show you what we're doing. By the way, this is remember that salad bar that I mentioned that shellfish eat? So this is one of the varieties of salad. This is one of the phytoplankton, the microscopic algae that the oysters eat. And so you grow these giant tubes of food that the microscopic oysters will devour, actually. All right, so what do I mean by supporting prosperous and sustainable shellfish aquaculture production? This is really focused on questions of how do you grow more shellfish and better quality shellfish while maximizing environmental sustainability. And this is where we can promote best practices that help the industry do that. What I sum this up as, this is really increasing the biological capacity of sustainable shellfish aquaculture. To give you an idea, this is sort of how many oysters do I put in a bag before it's too crowded? How do I, when I put cages in the water, how do I minimize the impacts on submerged aquatic vegetation? Or like where do I put stuff? These are the types of questions that should be under this heading. But you need more than, the farm has to do more than have the biological capacity. It has to have the human capacity. So we are really also have a goal here of capable individuals supporting shellfish production. We're really trying to help train people, and that could be everything from the farm onto management, the regulators, the communications, marketing, and policy, people understanding the business and helping that the industry, including regulation of it, go forward. And then there's community, and I have really enjoyed this part of it. This is a lot of fun, providing the best available science so that communities can make informed policies and decisions about shellfish aquaculture. This is not saying that we're advocating for shellfish aquaculture, but providing the best science in that public discussion about it. So the communities, and the last one I showed you, is about the human capacity to raise shellfish. So we are trying to increase the biological capacity to raise shellfish and the human capacity to raise shellfish. And if you're in the business of doing that, then you worry about flooding the market. So we are actually also looking at how we can increase demand for shellfish produced both here in Virginia and the United States. This is not that we're going to go out and market particular people's shellfish. We can't do that. But what we have found is by educating the public and consumers and restaurants about the quality of shellfish that are being produced and how they're being produced, that we generally have found that increases sales broadly for the industry. All right, wrapping up here, how do we get there? The first thing we have to do is we have to respond to stakeholders. What we do in the Shellfish Aquaculture Initiative should not be from what I think is important. It should be listening to the folks who are in the business and in the regulatory environment and finding out what they need. Then it's going and collaborating, because what we want to do is, once we know what needs to be solved, we want to get the right people in the room to tackle those questions. That could be here at VIMS. It could be out in the industry. It could be at other institutions, but we should put the right people together. We're going to engage stakeholders and students. It's critical to me that we bring students into this equation, and that could be everything from young students up to graduate students, and have them be part of the process. We're lucky enough at VIMS that we can innovate. We can try new things. We're in a position that we can try new equipment, we can try new techniques, and we can help test those for the industry. We're also in a position of training. So we're routinely giving people some of the skills where they can go succeed in this industry, and serving as a center of knowledge of the best available science so that we can be a resource for those discussions. Lastly, we have to evaluate the impacts. And there are a couple words up there, but really what those words boil down to is, did we move the needle? If we do some research, if we do a project, how are we having an effect on the community? How are we doing that with the industry? That could be new regulations. It could be number of businesses, number of shellfish, but everything that we do with the Shellfish Aquaculture Science Initiative should come back to, did we make a change? Did we improve things? And with that, I can answer any questions about the science behind the slurp. Yes, sir.
How do you feel your efforts are being received in the industry?
That's a good question. I'm relatively new here. I should have mentioned that. I started in June. And one of my first priorities was getting out and trying to meet as many people around the state as I could. And so I'm excited to meet a number of these folks. It's also it's impressive how big our state is when you look at the diversity of what we do, from the northern neck around down to Lynn Haven and then back up on the eastern shore. So I have the sense that the industry is interested in working together and actually glad to be asked. I think, they knew that, but everybody likes knowing that they're being directly asked how we can help. So far, I'm hopeful.
Hello. I grew up in Annapolis and was a big fan of soft shell clams.
Yes.
Ipswich, I'm not sure what other names they have, but I just don't see them around here. Is this out of their range?
I'm going to refer you to, she's not available tonight, but Dr. Rochelle Seitz here at VIMS is working on some projects looking at the potential for aquaculture of soft shell clams. So we think that the environment can support them, but the wild populations aren't what they used to be. And if I recall, she mentioned a particular storm. We had an event and the populations crashed after that and they haven't recovered. And so for whatever reason, we don't see them in abundance in the wild we used to. And but we do think that they can survive as an aquacultured species. So you may see some of that. I like a good soft shell clam myself. So.
If I read an earlier graphic correctly, and if my memory serves me correctly, I think it said Virginia led the oyster aquaculture in the country, and it listed a figure, I think, of 15 million and employing hundreds of people.
Yep.
That just seems low figures to me.
Low figures. So it was actually in the U.S. On the East Coast. So for Eastern oyster production, we lead the East Coast, but there's a lot of production of oysters out of the Gulf Coast as well. And then the West Coast has a different species that they grow over there. So that is, and remember, that's also aquaculture. That's not our fishery. So that's not including what's harvested from that.
So the hundreds of people is aquaculture people?
That is, it includes clams.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, it's not all the watermen.
It's not, no. That is particularly shellfish aquaculture, people who are in some way cultivating shellfish versus going out and harvesting them.
I should have picked up on that. Thank you.
No, sorry. And we got some questions after that. We'll take some questions from online.
Hello, great talk. I was wondering whether you knew what the reason, or if there was a reason for America's reluctance to embrace aquaculture.
I don't know. This is me guessing. I don't have data for this, but certainly one of the things that we have done is when we look at aquaculture, we typically run into permitting hurdles. And it's a question of what do we want to allow? And the way we have viewed our oceans is a common resource. And so typically we say you cannot do this here or here. And so if I wanted to be somebody who is raising some type of animal or plant in the ocean, I have to find a place that after everything has been vetoed, like what's left. And what that means is often you're not necessarily putting your farm in the best place to grow something. You're putting it in the place you could get permission to that allowed stuff to grow. And again, that's a community decision. I'm not advocating that we should have more aquaculture everywhere and what that looks like. But I think that's one of the main things that goes into it. When we've talked about the EEZ, the economic, help me with that other E, zone, the economic exclusion zone, we have a tremendous amount of waters available for us to do this in, but you get into federal permitting and that has been something that has been slow. Again, that's a community decision and something we have to come to agree on what we want to do. Yes.
Hi. So we are going to ask some questions from the online crew. We have a question that says that someone is finding oysters with a calcified blister that's filled with a very foul liquid if it's broken. And she wants to know if you know what that is.
Is this Ms. Cody? All right, then let me go to, she had actually asked me if I could put this picture up. So I don't know if you can see this online now. You should be able to see back towards the hinge. You see that sort of unattractive looking thing there at the end, right? Does anybody come across these when they've eaten oysters? All right, yeah, you have. So this won't hurt you, all right? It probably actually, we don't have a lot of evidence that it hurts the oyster, but I am going to tell you that it's a worm. And so when I start talking about mudworms, people are like, I don't think I want to eat oysters. But mudworms are little worms that live, they find the outside of the shell of the oyster, and they have the ability to burrow into that shell. Once they burrow into it, they then stick their feeding appendages outside the shell and eat what's around the oyster outside. So this isn't in the oyster meat. It's not something that you consume. It's not something that actually gets into the shell. But the oyster can sense that there and tends to wall it off. And so in this picture that was sent, that is an extreme blister. That's unusual. I'm trying to see if towards the lip, you can see some discoloration around that. And that may be where one little tube has come down and they've walled it off. So the oyster, when the oyster makes pearls, it walls things off. This is very similar. It's just that it hasn't hardened that up and put a pearly white layer over it yet. Why don't you want these? There's a couple reasons you don't want mud blisters on your worms. Is one, when you shuck the oyster, sometimes the shell gets a little brittle. So if anybody's a shucker, and nobody likes fighting to get into an oyster. But if you shuck and you don't protect your hand, you also don't want the oyster that crumbles in your hand, because the knife tends to go into your hand. And I'm speaking from experience. So that's one problem with it. The other is, if you burst that blister with your shucking knife on the way in, it's water that a worm has been living in, and it's not particularly tasty and it smells bad. So I tend to throw those oysters out when that happens. But it's not something you're consuming. And typically, most consumers we don't notice that when we're getting oysters, because again, they've been shucked already. That was probably something the shucker dealt with before it got to you.
Ed wants to know, what are some of the negative environmental effects of oyster aquaculture that you alluded to?
So, what we've found is, it's actually, in my personal experience, we have had trouble finding sort of negative environmental effects. So what would those be? Those would be sort of buildup of, they're eating what's in the water and they're pooping. Now, and that poop might go to the bottom. Now, that wasn't from something that we added to the water. They're just converting something in the water. But if you put a farm somewhere, maybe that piles up. When I've looked at this, when I was down at Dauphin Island Sea Lab, we looked at where a bunch of farms had gone in, and we stopped looking because we couldn't find effects. And so the research interest sort of went away. I think if you look at the literature, if you have very, very dense populations of shellfish, you can get a buildup of feces and pseudo feces underneath that farm. That can be anoxic, and that's not a particularly productive environment. I will say that I've typically only seen that where you have like 3D culture, like with mussels, like they have in Prince Edward Island, where you're growing mussels this way, and you're also growing them this way. That's a lot of animals per cubic meter of water. And so that's a lot. You can get a lot of biology happening underneath that. But the spatial, that doesn't extend much away from that part of the farm. Of course, there's also, if I have a farm and I'm putting particularly floating gear in the water, you can get concerns about, is that shading the stuff underneath? There are a number of things like that. But again, I think best management practices can help limit that. And some of that happens to your earlier question about this is siting. Then in many cases, like you can't put a shellfish farm in certain places because of those concerns. I think we had a question up here.
Yeah, thanks. I guess I'm interested to understand the distribution of production between aquaculture that is grown versus, say, dredged, which is some people plant those oysters, but particularly, have you studied whether or not dredging particularly is net bad? And I've actually heard, whether it's a myth or not, that from people who are in that business, well, it's good to stir it up and pull the dredge across the bottom because it frees the oyster from the mud. And have you done that kind of study? And should we be steering towards one or the other?
I have not, and I think it's open to debate. And I think it does come down to, when we talk about good, like the question before yours was about negative environmental effects, and then environmental, like what are the environmental benefits? Those are very human judgments. We have to decide, like there's no clear science that says that something is bad. We have to sort of decide what's bad. And so when we talk about dredging, for those who don't know, I think when some people hear dredges, they're imagining this big hydraulic pump that's sucking up the bottom and sort of like a giant vacuum that's vacuuming up the ocean floor. An oyster dredge is really more of a rake that's a surface. It's got teeth that maybe extend about this far, and you drag it behind the boat, and it's grabbing oyster shell at the top, but it's not digging up the earth. You don't want it to do that. It wants to just be skipping over the surface and pulling up those oysters. I agree. I've heard mixed reviews on that. Certainly, some species are going to react in a way that their abundances are going to decline if you dredge. Other species, and it certainly does seem for oysters, if I dredge a bed that has an old bed that has not been turned over in a long time, if I dredge it at the right time of year and I put clean shell surface up to the water, it can happen that I can absolutely increase the set of oysters there. I'll get more what you might call strike or set on that shell because you're seeing that. Because you remember, from a microscopic larval oyster swimming around York River or Chesapeake Bay, when they come down to the bottom, they're trying to find something hard to attach to, and one of their favorite substrates is another oyster shell. If we have any mud on that shell, they can't perceive that shell there, so they don't know that they're on a shell. So when you give them fresh shell, it does, whether I push it overboard or I turn it over, it can increase that. So some species will benefit and some won't. So I think that's something that we'd have to do the math on to figure out based on what we're trying to increase, if that's a benefit or not. I don't know how our wild fishery harvest compares to our aquaculture. And you're right, we do have aquaculture that's on the bottom as well. So I don't yet know. I don't have a handle on that yet. I apologize.
All right, I think we have time for one more question. So I do see a hand in the audience.
An issue that's come up recently is the fact that there's a lot of resistance along the shorelines to aquaculture farms. And so oysters are pretty much restricted to the Baylor public grounds and the leased grounds. Right. But there's all of that nice water further out.
Right.
And so I know this legislation is needed to change that, but that's just I think an interesting issue that we've got so much more water that we could grow oysters in than we're able to use.
Right. There's, I think, regulatory environment says where we can do things, but then also we have to see are there waters that we can use that are further from shore that would create less conflict with shoreline residents? And can we go into deeper water? And what are the techniques that would allow somebody to have a business that can make money? Because one of the things I found out about sustainability is that, of course, it has to be something that's environmentally sustainable, but it also has to be something that the individual can make a living at, or we don't see it persist very long.
Thank you, Dr. Walton.
Thank you.
And this is our last After Hours of the year. Make sure you subscribe to eTidings to find out about our upcoming programs for next year if you haven't already. If there's a question that we weren't able to answer, please send it to either programs@vims.edu or the email address that Dr. Walton has up, salt-sci@vims.edu, and that's SI, and we will get it answered. And thank you again so much for coming, and thank you, Dr. Walton.
Thank you all.